It all started with the smallest shifts, subtle changes in her behavior that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. We'd been together for years, and I'd always thought we were on the same page about everything. We shared dreams about the future, plans for a family, even talks of the places we'd travel together one day. But lately, something just felt off. It's hard to explain, but it was like there was this distance between us that hadn't been there before. I wanted to brush it off, but the feeling nagged at me. At first, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, relationships go through phases, right? But then I started noticing her phone was always on silent. She'd leave it face down on the table, and when it buzzed, she'd casually reach for it, like she was trying too hard to act like it was nothing. Or she'd glance at it, smirk a little, and then quickly tuck it away before I could see anything. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but each time, the pit in my stomach got a little heavier. Our conversations felt different, too. We used to talk about everything: our dreams, our daily annoyances, the funny things that happened at work. But now, whenever I asked her about her day, her responses were vague. It was always the same: it was fine or nothing much happened, and then she'd quickly turn the conversation around to ask about me. It was like she was keeping me at arm's length, blocking off a part of her life that she didn't want me to see. I tried to tell myself that she was just stressed, maybe busy with something she didn't want to talk about. But I'd catch her spending more time getting ready to go out with friends I'd never heard of. She started making plans without me, casually mentioning that she'd be out that evening or that she was meeting up with some old friend. I'd ask who, and she'd give me a name I didn't recognize, brushing it off like it was no big deal. I wanted to trust her, I really did, but these little things were stacking up, and they started to feel impossible to ignore. I'd never thought of myself as a suspicious person. We had years together built on love and trust, and I never wanted to question that. But now it was like I was seeing someone different, someone who was hiding things, even if she wouldn't admit it. Every instinct told me something was wrong, but I was terrified of what I'd find if I looked too closely. One night she fell asleep beside me with her phone unlocked, and I found myself staring at it, feeling a mix of curiosity, fear, and dread. Part of me wanted to just turn over and forget about it, to trust that whatever was bothering me would pass. But the other part, the part that had been growing restless and uneasy, couldn't ignore the opportunity right in front of me. All the small changes, the vague answers, the time spent with friends I didn't know, it had built up so much that my curiosity finally tipped over the edge. I knew looking at her phone would be crossing the line, but I had to know. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and opened her messages, my heart pounding louder with each swipe. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly, but I'd know it when I saw it. Scrolling through her recent texts, I saw the usual conversations with friends and family, but then I saw a thread with a name I didn't recognize. It wasn't someone she'd ever mentioned before, and I could feel my stomach sink before I even opened it. The messages told me everything I didn't want to know. They were flirty, casual, in a way that wasn't just friendly, filled with inside jokes and late-night conversations that made my stomach twist. She'd been messaging him late into the night, sometimes talking about how she felt misunderstood and unappreciated. There were mentions of plans they'd made, things they'd done together that she'd never told me about. I felt my face grow hot as I read, the betrayal hitting me harder with each new line. The worst part was the way she talked about me to him, as if I were some background character in her life, someone she barely cared about. I read messages about her feeling trapped in our relationship, and how he made her feel alive in a way that I apparently didn't. It was like a knife twisting in my heart, each word cutting a little deeper. All the things I thought we'd shared, all the memories we'd built together, it was clear now that she'd been building something else with someone else, right under my nose. I put the phone down, feeling numb, shocked, and empty. I couldn't believe it. Part of me wanted to wake her up, to demand answers, but another part of me was just broken. Everything I thought I knew about her felt like a lie, like I'd been living in some fantasy she'd already left behind. In that moment, I knew my life was about to change, and I wasn't sure I'd ever feel the same way about love or trust again. Days went by after I discovered the messages, each one heavier than the last. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I tried to go about my day, those messages echoed in my mind, the laughter, the inside jokes, the plans they'd made together. I kept thinking, How did it get to this point? I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd come to her senses and realized the hurt she'd caused, but I knew deep down I needed answers. I needed to know why she'd done this, even if hearing it would break me all over again. When I finally worked up the courage to confront her, I felt like I was stepping into a scene one only ever watched in movies. My heart was pounding as I sat her down, my palms sweaty, my mouth dry. I could barely look at her, knowing what I'd seen. I asked her if she was happy, if there was someone else, someone she felt more for than she felt for me. I wanted to give her a chance to be honest, to explain herself, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there'd be a shred of remorse, an apology, or even just an acknowledgement of my pain. She paused, looking down, and then almost casually she admitted it. She said she wasn't sure if our relationship was what she wanted anymore, that maybe she had feelings for someone else. There was a detached coldness in the way she spoke, as if she was just talking about the weather. She didn't look at me with regret or guilt, but with a strange kind of indifference, like I was just an afterthought. That's when it really hit me. She had moved on, emotionally if not physically, and she didn't seem to care about what her actions had done to me. Hearing her say it, all my fears, all my doubts became real. The life we'd built, the dreams we'd shared, felt like they were slipping right through my fingers. I could feel myself growing numb, my mind struggling to process the weight of it all. She didn't even apologize. She didn't seem to care about the impact of her actions, about the betrayal, or about the person she'd shattered. I felt like a stranger in my own relationship, like I'd been sharing my heart with someone who wasn't really there. Everything I had loved and trusted in her was gone, replaced by someone who was willing to throw it all away without a second thought. I left that conversation feeling empty, completely hollow. She'd taken everything from me, the love, the memories, the trust. I walked away that day knowing I'd never be able to look at her the same way again, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to trust anyone else either. After we broke up, she didn't waste much time moving on with him. They were together almost instantly, making no effort to hide it. Mutual friends would tell me about them, how they seemed happy, how she was doing fine without me. It stung to hear it, like pouring salt in an open wound. I was left to pick up the pieces of a relationship I thought was everything, while she seemed to have moved on without a second thought. At first I tried not to think about it, to keep my head down and focus on getting through each day, but it was hard. Every little reminder of her felt like a punch to the gut. Weeks went by, and while I was struggling to rebuild, I started hearing things about her new relationship. Apparently he wasn't everything she'd hoped for. From what friends told me, he wasn't as committed as she thought he was, and they'd already had a few issues. She'd given up a steady, loyal relationship for someone who didn't even seem that serious about her. There was something almost ironic about it, but instead of feeling satisfied, I felt sad for her, and for myself for everything we had thrown away. Then, one night, out of nowhere, she reached out. Seeing her name pop up on my phone sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend she didn't exist anymore, but curiosity got the better of me. She apologized, saying she'd made a huge mistake, and that she wished things had turned out differently. She admitted that she'd been swept up by the excitement, by the idea of something new, only to realize that it wasn't what she thought it would be. She said she missed the life we'd built, the comfort and security of knowing someone would be there no matter what. Her words felt empty to me. She wanted back the life we'd had, but she'd been the one to destroy it. I'd spent so much time feeling heartbroken, wondering if I'd ever be able to trust again, while she had just walked away for something she thought was better. And now, here she was, realizing the reality of her choices and expecting me to somehow be there to make things right again. For a brief moment, I felt sorry for her. She was realizing the hard way that not everything that glitters is gold, that the thrill of something new can wear off quickly, leaving only regret in its wake. But I couldn't let myself be dragged back into that mess. I'd already lost so much of myself to this relationship, and I knew that going back would only hurt me more. Her regret was hers to bear, and I wasn't going to be her safety net. She was left to live with the choices she'd made, while I finally understood that I needed to move on, leaving her and her regrets behind. It took me a long time to come to terms with everything that had happened, Moving on from someone you once saw a future with isn't easy, especially when betrayal taints all the good memories you had together. At first, every day felt like a struggle. I'd wake up with a heavy weight on my chest, feeling like a part of me was missing. The trust I once had, the security I felt in our relationship, was shattered. For a while, I wondered if I'd ever feel that kind of love again, or if I'd even want to. I had lost a part of myself in that relationship, and it took time to realize that maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all. Instead of focusing on what I'd lost, I started trying to rebuild myself. I threw myself into my hobbies, spending more time with friends, and working on the parts of me that had been neglected while I was so focused on her. I started going to the gym more, pushing myself physically as a way to work through the anger and frustration that lingered. Slowly, I began to see progress not just physically, but emotionally. I felt myself getting stronger, more independent. I realized that while she'd moved on, I was the one who was truly learning and growing from this experience. As I reconnected with friends and family, I realized how much I'd missed while I was so wrapped up in trying to make things work with her. I'd put so much energy into keeping our relationship together, into being someone she would want, that I'd lost touch with who I really was. It felt good to rediscover myself, to find joy in things outside of a relationship. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself and not for someone else's expectations. Eventually, I reached a point where the anger and hurt started to fade. I no longer checked her social media, no longer cared about what she was doing or who she was with. I had accepted that her betrayal was a reflection of her choices, not my worth. She had to live with the consequences, with the regret of leaving something real for a fleeting thrill. And while she might never find the peace she's looking for, I was finally on a path that felt right. Looking back, I'm almost grateful for the experience, painful as it was. It taught me resilience, self-respect, and the importance of staying true to myself. I learned that love shouldn't be about constantly questioning or feeling like you're not enough. It should be built on mutual respect, loyalty, and honesty, things she ultimately couldn't offer me. Now I can say I've moved on, leaving her and all those painful memories behind. I'm open to love again, but this time I know better what I want and what I deserve. In the end, her betrayal set me free in a way I hadn't expected. I walked away stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever the future holds.